The echo of footsteps resonated on the cold marble of Mexico City's central courthouse. The courtroom was packed. Merchants, law students, and curious onlookers waited anxiously. Everyone murmured the same thing. A peasant dared to challenge Judge Alejandro Cortez, the most feared man in the district. The air smelled of anticipation and anticipated mockery. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of restless bodies. Women with fans giggled softly, convinced they were about to see a ridiculous spectacle. Students whispered that it would be the quickest lesson of the week, an ignorant man being crushed by the arrogance of the law. Everything was set up for humiliation. The bailiff banged his cane and shouted, "Stand!" The side door opened, and Judge Cortez, 58, appeared, imposing in his black robe. He walked slowly, with the confidence of someone who believes justice belongs to him. His hardened face showed no compassion, only contempt for those who did not belong to his world. The audience immediately rose to its feet, as if the ground were burning beneath their feet. Alexander sat high on the platform, looked haughtily at the crowd, and then settled his gaze on a standing man. This man seemed out of place in every detail, like a stain on a flawless canvas. And that was precisely what made him unforgettable. It was about Mateo Ramirez, a 42-year-old peasant from Oaxaca. He held a straw hat in his hands, and his boots were stained with fresh mud. Suppressed laughter rippled through the room like a poisonous murmur. For the elite, seeing that man in that space was like seeing an intruder in their sacred temple. Judge Cortez frowned, leaning forward. "Is this the plaintiff?" he asked, his voice thick with venom. The clerk nodded, barely murmuring his name. Alejandro let out a dry laugh that echoed throughout the courtroom. "A peasant! This will be quick," he declared disdainfully. The words stirred the students, who laughed shamelessly. Some gently banged on the benches, enjoying the scene. To them, Mateo wasn't a man seeking justice, but a clown on a stage that didn't belong to him. The judge himself seemed to revel in the atmosphere, confident of his victory before even beginning. Mateo, however, took a deep breath. His gaze remained fixed, not on the students, nor on the mocking ladies, but on the platform. He knew that every second of silence was an opportunity not to show weakness. He didn't respond to the mockery, didn't ask for sympathy. He simply waited, clutching his notebook to his chest. The bailiff tried to impose order, but the laughter still vibrated off the walls. Alejandro banged the gavel, smiling ironically. "Speak, peasant. But remember, I won't tolerate insolence." The room fell silent, as if someone had turned off the lamps. Everyone was waiting for the stumble, the mistake that would confirm what they already thought. Mateo took a step forward. His rough hands trembled slightly, but his voice came out clearly. "I come on behalf of my community, because we have been dispossessed of our lands by a landowner who doesn't respect the established boundaries." The judge laughed cruelly. "A peasant talking about boundaries? This will be entertaining." The murmur grew. Students smiled as if waiting for a final blow. A woman in the audience lowered her head, unable to look. But Mateo didn't back down. His silence was the calm before the storm. And when he opened his notebook, the laughter began to die down, one by one. Something unexpected was about to happen. "Shut up, peasant!" thundered Judge Cortez, banging his gavel. The audience burst into laughter, convinced that the humiliation was just beginning. But no one imagined that the man in his worn clothes and dirty boots would utter words that would shake the entire courtroom. Mateo looked up without hesitation. He opened his crumpled notebook and recited in a firm voice, "According to Article 247 of the 1821 Land and Water Code, every strip of land inherited under legitimate title must be respected, even if the fences have been altered." Silence fell like the blow of a hammer. The students stopped laughing, surprised. One of them murmured, "We saw that last semester." The judge blinked, incredulous. as if he couldn't understand how a peasant could quote laws with such precision. Alejandro tried to laugh, but his voice no longer held the same confidence. The entire courtroom noticed. Mateo didn't pause. Furthermore, the 1875 case, Montiel versus Ramirez, established a precedent in favor of peasant communities in identical situations. The clerk dropped his pen, the metallic sound echoing in the courtroom. The judge's authority seemed to crumble before everyone's eyes. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. The mockery turned to bewilderment. The old woman in the front row clutched a rosary and whispered, "Let him speak, let him speak." The peasants present raised their heads with pride. The man they had seen plowing the land now spoke like a seasoned jurist. Alexander banged the gavel furiously. "Enough! I'm in charge here. Silence in the courtroom!" But no one immediately obeyed. The people were no longer laughing. The students exchanged incredulous glances. The judge, absolute master of the court, found himself facing a peasant who disarmed him with the very law he had sworn to uphold. The magistrate tried to compose himself, but sweat glistened on his forehead. "Where did you get that?" he asked contemptuously. Mateo held up the notebook like a banner. "From the municipal archives, Your Honor. I spent entire nights reading and copying. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what the law says." That "I know what the law says" fell like a thunderclap. It was more than an argument. It was a direct challenge to the judge's authority. The audience held its breath. What had begun as a circus was taking the form of a real battle, and Alejandro was no longer in absolute control. A student leaned toward his classmate and whispered, "This is no longer humiliation. This is history." The audience's eyes shone, some with fear, others with hope. The peasant had transformed the atmosphere with just a few words. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The judge, flustered, tried to regain his cruel tone. "Very well, Herrera. If you think you know so much, then enlighten us. But remember, laws are not recited like prayers. They require precision." It was a mockery disguised as a challenge. Alejandro hoped Mateo would stumble. But Mateo took a deep breath, turned a page in his notebook, and began quoting articles, years, and rulings in detail. Each word was a direct blow to the judge's arrogance, and for the first time, the laughter in the courtroom turned into subdued applause. The battle was just beginning. The judge believed that one sentence would be enough to silence him, but every word of Matthew was a brick in a new wall. The room stopped being a stage for mockery and became a classroom of justice. The fans stopped mid-air, in disbelief. The marble gave off a distinct chill, that of nascent respect. And the echo of the hammer no longer imposed fear, but doubts. Mateo ran his rough fingertip along the edge of the notebook. "It is recorded in the 1821 registry that the boundaries are immutable," he said. A student whispered, "Doctrine of adverse possession," astonished. The youngest, half Mexico, half L.A., got the grades. It wasn't just ancient law, it was ancestral voice with precision. Laughter shrank like a shadow without light. Alejandro Cortés clenched his jaw and struck the gavel. "Order!" he shouted, but his voice cracked like glass. El escribano tragó en seco, avoiding his eyes. Mateo kept his gaze steady, without pride, without fear. "I came to defend what feeds my people," he said. And in the back rows, someone stopped shaking. A rumor spread like wind through a cornfield. "Where did you learn this?" a young lawyer asked. "From sleepless nights and borrowed books," Mateo replied. "From a retired teacher who believed in my hands." That phrase took root in weary hearts. Dignity filled the pews, as if it were paying admission. The judge looked for a trap in the labyrinth of the law. "Article 152, interrupted possession," he snapped viciously. Mateo closed his eyes for a second and breathed. "A 20-year interruption extinguishes a claim without recognition," he said. "And there is recognition in 1999, signed by the landowner." A pen fell to the floor. O silencio caiu junto. A young man raised his hand, trembling with certainty. We saw it in class, exactly as he said. The authority rearranged itself in the room, changing owners. Not by title, but by consonance with the truth. The muddy boots no longer seemed like intruders. They were witnesses of the path taken to get there. Alejandro hardened his expression like someone signing a sentence. "This is theater," he spat, looking at the gallery. "A show of a people without technique." But the people had already taken their seats in the front row, and every word of Mateo had a receipt and date. The audience now wanted more. "I am presenting a copy of the registry and boundary map," he said. The notebook opened like an everyday altar. Names, stamps, dates, boundaries, streams, old fences. Papers that smelled of smoke and adobe cooking. The law, stripped of Latinisms, sounded human, and therefore irresistible. El alguacil miró al juez, asking for a sign. Alejandro hesitated a fraction of a sigh. "Admit for verification," the clerk said tensely. The word admit entered like the sun through a crack. The audience gasped like someone who had gone scuba diving. And hope, timid, raised its head. "Mateo cerrado o caderno, sem triunfolismo. Non peo favor, solo revisión justa," dijo. "Let the law be law also for those who sow." A murmur of approval went around the columns. Some calloused hands touched each other in silent prayer, and the judge realized that he was no longer alone at the top. Alejandro bent down, seeking to regain ground. "Final warning, Herrera. The court's patience is finite." Mateo did not lower his eyes. He raised the cause. "And that of my people too, Your Honor," he responded manso. "But we are taking the slowest and strongest route here." The room understood. The clock had changed owners. When the door turned into a blade of shadow, the wolf in the suit entered. Tomás Villagrán, 49, steely smile and inventory look. He wore the hacienda on his shoulders and favors on his tie. The runners whispered his name like a sentence. The judge breathed a sigh of relief, as if he had seen reinforcements arrive. And the public felt the cold of the well-paid maneuvers. Villagrán didn't greet anyone. He obeyed. "This isn't mass, it's law," he said, without looking at Mateo. "And the law doesn't fit in market notebooks." The sentence cut through the air, made to bleed. Some laughed reflexively, others bit their tongues. Mateo held the notebook as if it were a seed. "Show me what you've got," demanded Tomás, his posture like a shop window. Mateo placed a copy in the center of the table. The lawyer checked, feigning expert boredom. The eyebrow trembled a millimeter, a danger sign. "Old paper," he said. "Out of date, or worse." The judge nodded quickly, writing the cue. "I'll bring this." Tomás held up a yellowed contract. "Mateo's grandfather's resignation. Land returned." Hope bent like a spike in a gale. A woman covered her mouth to keep from crying. "Enough theater," whispered a student. And fear tried to reclaim its seat. Mateo asked to see the paper without his voice trembling. The rough fingers read like someone plowing. "Date 1978. Stamp. 90s model," he pointed out. A buzz ran through the room. Inconsistency. The magistrate requested the document for inspection. The judge scratched the back of his neck, feeling the floor move. Villagrán smiled sharply and changed his angle. "Article 310, Item B, nullity due to prescription." He planned the question like a noose in the dark. Mateo leafed through the notebook, found the right thread. "It does not apply after acts of tax recognition," he said. "There are taxes paid based on these limits." A chorus of surprise erupted in little ahs. Students took notes as if saving a map. The clerk looked up, almost smiling. The hacienda version was losing ink in public. Villagrán blinked slowly, calculating another route. The audience realized he could make mistakes too. At that, there was a sound of boots and spurs in the square. Armed foremen were circling like a storm. The judge regained his color, savoring the siege. "Order must be maintained," he proclaimed paternally. But order with rifles is just enforced silence, and from within another kind of force was born. The first hands went up in defense. "Let him speak!" shouted a voice from Oaxaca. Cloth flags went up, written in charcoal. "Villagran ergo a palma. Insolent circus." But the circus had become an assembly of souls, and the circus ring now was the platform itself. Magistrate Salinas requested expertise and time. "Without truth, no sentence will stand." The judge bit the edge of his pride, keeping quiet. Villagran tapped his watch. "Power doesn't wait." Mateo responded without raising his voice. "Justice, yes. And when she waits, she learns the whole way." Tomas took another paper out of the dark folder. "Cousin's signature, recent sale to the hacienda." A collective no echoed through the hall's columns. Mateo recalled the warning in the blood. "Never sign alone." "Forensics, too," Salinas ordered firmly. "The control mask has gained its first crack." The chapter's final hook fell like a bell. It wasn't just a debate. It was a duel with an audience. Villagran put away the blade, promising to return. The people stood up, refusing to be extras. And Mateo, with the notebook on his chest, seemed bigger. Outside, the sky sharpened the next scene. The murmur in the room turned into anxious whispers as Tomas Villagran held up a yellowed piece of paper with steady hands. "Here is the irrefutable proof," he proclaimed in a grave voice. "A contract signed by this man's grandfather, renouncing all claims to the land." The echo of his words fell like a slab on the peasants' hearts. The suppressed laughter reappeared, like embers rekindled by mockery. Mateo felt a blow to his stomach, as if the earth itself had opened up beneath his feet. Judge Alejandro smiled maliciously, convinced that the humiliation had reached its peak. "What do you say now, peasant?" he said with venomous irony. Several heads in the crowd bowed in resignation, as if their fate had been sealed by a piece of paper. With slow steps, Mateo asked to see the document. He took it respectfully, like someone carrying a family wound. His rough fingers ran over the page, stopping at the bottom corner. Immediately, a trace of doubt crossed his face. The audience held their breath, waiting for the final fall. "The notary seal is a model used in the 1990s, not 1978, he stated firmly. The silence exploded like dynamite. The law students looked at each other in disbelief, while one muttered, "It's impossible, you're right. That seal doesn't match." Judge Alejandro paled, trying to hide his disdain with a gesture of contempt. Villagran reacted quickly like a wounded predator. "A printing error, nothing more. The signature is authentic and that's enough." But Judge Salinas asked for the document to examine it. After a few seconds, his voice thundered, "This paper has serious inconsistencies." A murmur ran through the benches, and the word falsification began to float in the air. The peasants raised their heads again, regaining a glimmer of hope. "I told you so," an old woman shouted from the back. The judge slammed his gavel violently, red-faced with fury. "Silence! This court will not become a circus." But it was no longer his voice that dominated. It was the collective murmur of distrust against him and his lawyer ally. Mateo took a deep breath and held up the document. "My grandfather never knew how to read or write. How could he sign a contract like that? His entire life was dedicated to defending these lands, and now they want to tarnish his name with forged papers." The words shot through the room like arrows, piercing hearts and consciences. A group of students stood up, unable to contain themselves. "You're right. The handwriting is suspect," one commented loudly. Villagran's credibility was crumbling before everyone's eyes. For the first time, the people didn't feel small in the face of the toga, or the power of money. The judge tried to regain control. "Until this document is verified, it will remain in the court's custody." But doubt had already been sown. Every glance toward Mateo had been transformed. They no longer saw him as an ignorant peasant, but as a man who stood firm with the truth in his hand. Mateo closed his notebook, his head held high. Justice cannot be bought, Your Honor, and every lie you bring will be exposed. The audience erupted in applause, ignoring the judge's shouts. Alejandro banged the gavel in vain. His authority slipped through his fingers like sand. Villagran smiled coldly, hiding his anger. "This is just beginning," he muttered to himself. And in that crooked smile lay the promise that the hacienda would not give up easily. The war had barely taken its first turn. Just when everyone thought their fate was hanging in the balance, a tired, firm voice echoed in the room. "We never certified Martin Ramirez's resignation." Everyone turned their heads in disbelief. A thin man emerged from the crowd, leaning on a cane with white hair and a black-covered notebook under his arm. It was Don Ramon Valdez, the former town clerk, whom many believed to be dead. The murmurs grew like a storm. "It's Don Ramon!" someone exclaimed, with a mixture of astonishment and relief. Judge Alejandro paled, trying to hide his discomfort. Villagran clenched his jaw, recognizing that this unexpected appearance could ruin his strategy. Judge Salinas raised his hand and ordered, "We will hear the witness." Don Ramon walked slowly down the central aisle, each step accompanied by the sharp sound of his cane on the floor. His gaze held decades of memory. "I knew Martin Ramirez, and I know his character. I would never have signed a resignation. And my personal records show that we never certified such a document." The audience reacted with a roar of surprise and approval. Farmers stood and applauded, and even some law students nodded respectfully. The judge angrily banged his gavel. "Inadmissible! He's an old, retired man. He has no legal standing." But the magistrate stopped him with a gesture. "A notary, even if retired, has weight as a witness. Let him speak." Don Ramon opened his black-covered notebook and placed it on the central table. His hands trembled, but his firm handwriting revealed meticulous records. "Here are the notes on every document that passed through my hands. And on these pages, there is no resignation by Martin Ramirez." The magistrate examined the lines carefully. The silence was so profound that the labored breathing of those present could be heard. Finally, Salinas looked up and spoke in a deep voice. "This notebook is consistent with other files we know of. Its testimony cannot be ignored." The room erupted in cheers as Alejandro sank into his seat. Villagran tried to react coldly. "That notebook could have been written yesterday. It's not valid proof." But the people no longer believed him. The notary himself raised his cane and said, "If you want proof, go to the municipal archives. There you will find the original books, covered in dust, waiting to be read." The peasants shouted loudly, "Let the archives be searched." The magistrate nodded solemnly. "We'll give the order. The truth isn't buried under false seals." The judge closed his eyes, knowing that every passing minute plunged him deeper into public shame. Mateo approached the old man, tears brimming in his eyes. "Thank you for speaking, Don Ramon. My grandfather did not die in vain." The clerk squeezed his shoulder. "Don't thank me, son. Thank your grandfather, who never let lies stain his name." The audience erupted in cheers and applause. Students frantically took notes, aware that they were witnessing living history. The judge shouted, "Silence, silence!" But no one obeyed him anymore. Power had changed hands. Villagran, without losing his composure, uttered a final, threatening sentence. "Do all the checks you want. By the time you're done, there may be no one left here to hear the verdict." His icy smile sank like a dark omen into every heart. When they opened the doors of the court, it wasn't air that came in, it was history. Men and women from Oaxaca, Guerrero, and the California border filled the halls. They carried banners made of blankets with charcoal letters, "The land is life. Without justice, there is no peace." The law students, half from Mexico City, half from Los Angeles, recorded with trembling hands. Judge Alejandro wanted to smile, but the human tide erased his expression. From that moment on, Fear no longer had a reserved seat in the front row. An older woman, with silver braids and volcanic eyes, raised her voice without asking permission. "That man speaks for all of us," he said, nodding his chin at Mateo. The wooden benches vibrated with a dense, urgent, irrepressible applause. A bailiff pounded the ground to impose order, but the ground was on the people's side. The marble did not look like a courtroom. It looked like a public square under a cloudy sky. On the platform, the gown looked small compared to the standing crowd. Villagran tried to regain the center with a smile carved like a knife. "Respect the premises, this is not a market," he said, seeking knowing laughter. But the echo of his phrase died against a wall of tired glances. Tired of promises, of false seals, of doors closed tight. Mateo took a step and raised the notebook like someone raising a flag. "We only ask that the law also be the law for those who plant," he stated clearly. From the depths arose an ancient song, low and stubborn like groundwater. First there were 3 voices, then 20, then 100, and then impossible to count. It wasn't a scream, it was a root intoning memory. It was corn saying, "We're still here." The students put down their cell phones and, out of modesty, listened in silence. The judge banged the gavel, but the gavel looked like a teaspoon against an iron door. Judge Salinas, on the other hand, let the chant finish its sentence. At the end of the song, the air could be cut with a spike. "We will continue with tests and expert reports," said Salinas, his voice rocky. "And any attempt at intimidation will be recorded and reported at the federal level." A hum of relief swept through the room like a mountain wind. Alejandro gritted his teeth. The case was no longer his, it belonged to the country he was looking at, and Ernesto's camera, the journalist, flickered like a nearby lighthouse. A young man from Los Angeles raised his hand with a mixed accent. "My father lost land there and here. History repeats itself," he said without trembling. His testimony crossed borders in a single prayer of a son. Villagran twisted his mouth. Emotions do not replace titles. But no one responded. The emotion was backed up with seals and maps. Reason and pain suddenly spoke the same language on the stage. The foreman butted rifle butts outside, a thunder of metal and blind obedience. Inside, the mothers clutched their children to their chests, but did not back down. "If they want to silence us, they'll have to silence an entire country," said someone without a name. Mateo looked at the judge without hatred, with a patience that burned more than fire. "They called us ignorant. We learned to read their laws down to the last comma." Humiliation suddenly seemed like an empty chair with a broken back. Alejandro sought oxygen in a gesture of borrowed authority. "Anyone who interrupts will be expelled," he threatened in a voice of paper. The magistrate looked at him briefly, as if remembering the royal regulations. "Anyone who brings evidence will be heard," he corrected firmly. That exchange changed the location of the door through which dignity entered, and the public understood it without needing a dictionary. Ernesto leaned toward Mateo, whispering between noise and prayers. "I need to go a few meters and send the telegraph so that this can be known today." Mateo nodded, knowing the risk that smelled like gunpowder around every corner. "Run for those who can't run," he said, and it sounded like a national order. A group opened a passageway, like a sea that respects a paper boat with a message. The journalist disappeared through the side door like an urgent secret. The judge saw the maneuver and thought he smelled an advantage in the chaos. "Note that the plaintiff is inciting disorder," he ordered the clerk, without shame. But the scribe did not move his hand. Ink does not write against conscience. Salinas cleared his throat. "What the country sees, the country will judge." Villagran counted the clocks with his eyes. He knew that time could save him. The crowd, meanwhile, did not negotiate. They remained standing, and to remain was to win. The chapter closed with the sound of determined footsteps and drums beating in the chest. With mothers wearing shawls, and students with backpacks heavy with notes, with farmers who smell of earth and freshly baked bread, with a judge who, for the first time, didn't know who he was looking at when he spoke, with a lawyer sharpening his next trap behind an icy smile, and with an old notebook that weighed like a collective birth certificate. The first shot outside sounded like someone had broken the sky with a stone. Inside, the room contracted, each chest searching for air where there was none. The foreman surrounded the building with torches that painted walls of fire. Judge Alejandro took a deep breath, believing that fear was his star witness. Villagran adjusted his red tie, certain that the lead would close any case, but Judge Salinas stood up, and his shadow weighed more than the weapons. "If they cross armed, they break the law," Salinas said, each syllable a seal. The local guards looked at the ground, torn between salary and conscience. Mothers hid their children under shawls, but there was no blind panic. There was determination, as if the room had remembered its backbone. Mateo took a step forward without shouting, so that everyone could hear equally. "Truth is not burned with torches. Smoke only makes it more visible." Ernesto hadn't returned yet. His absence was a taut thread in the air. "If it reaches the telegraph, they'll see us from Tijuana to New York," said a young man. A student proposed forming human runners, relays to the corner. They weren't heroes. They were citizens holding up the street with their bodies. The idea caught on like wildfire. They organized it without asking permission. The crowd learned logistics at the same pace they learned law. A butt-butt made splinters fly from the side door, a shower of wood. A child cried. His mother hugged him and placed her hard on his head. "Order!" shouted the judge, but no one would lease him authority in installments anymore. Villagran whispered something to an undercover guard, shadow within a shadow. The infiltrator advanced with a handgun, his eyes on command, and his haste to pay. Fate took a deep breath, and for a second closed its eyes so as not to look. The shot inside was a lightning bolt enclosed in a bell. A local guard fell with his arm open in red, his cry broken. The room was split between running and staying, between fear and fury. Mateo lifted the notebook like someone lifting an invisible wall. "Don't respond with violence!" His voice was sane over the abyss. Don Ramon raised his cane. "Let it be recorded." They shot to silence. The students surrounded the wounded man, improvising a tourniquet with backpacks. A young doctor, who had gone just to look, became a column of light. "Pressure here. Breathe with me," he said, and the room came alive. The journalist still hadn't returned. Anxiety was nibbling at everyone's heels. Salinas ordered a record of names, weapons, positions, times, everything. The truth is also defended with lists when gunpowder wants to rule. Then, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of a shipwreck, a scream came in. "He did it!" The young messenger burst in with a dusty smile and bell-like eyes. Ernesto arrived at the telegraph, the message went out, and they already know it all over the country. The room exploded with relief that was almost painful because it was so intense and necessary. Alejandro squeezed the mallet like a child squeezing a broken toy. Villagran, without blinking, thought, "Then we'll have to raise the stakes." The siege tightened from the outside. The torches drew gallows shadows. Inside, the hands intertwined, and a new, strong fabric was born. "If one falls, two follow. If two fall, four follow," said a voice. The song returned, this time deeper, more united like forged metal. The judge wanted to order an eviction, but the order found no takers. The judge said, "This premises remain under the custody of the state." A murmur of trumpets and drums filtered from the square, far away at first. Then close, then here, until it vibrates in the pews like a heart. The National Guard turned the corner with discipline that cut through the smoke. The foreman looked at the uniform and remembered that not everything can be bought. The torches went out one by one, like fireflies that understand the dawn, and the building finally breathed with its lungs full of country. Villagran made one last bid to avoid leaving empty-handed. "Recent sale, signature of cousin Pedro," he announced, poison on paper. The murmur was sharp. The room leaned towards the document. Salinas took it, measured features, rhythms, ink habits, and pulse. "There will be expertise. There will be no verdict without truth," he declared like the main bell. Mateo exhaled slowly. The trap was alive, but so was his patience. Ernesto finally entered, with dark circles under his eyes from racing and a chest that looked like a flag. "You see us on the radio, in newspapers, on wires that cross borders," he said. Mateo shook his hand, and the peasants gave him a chorus of thanks. "Today, the law spoke loudly because we listened to it together," the journalist added. The judge looked at his own shoes as if they were foreign territory, and the chapter closed with a certainty. Silence had lost its monopoly. Outside, the horses walked away, leaving a sound of tired horseshoes. Inside, there were papers to be reviewed and wounds to be calmly bandaged. But no one was alone anymore, and that altered the entire power equation. The judge closed the day with a "we will continue" that sounded like a promise. Mateo put away the notebook like someone saving bread for the journey, and the court, suddenly, seemed larger than its stone dome. Judge Alejandro felt a surge of power again when he ordered Mateo to take the stand. "Let's see if you repeat your prayers in response to my questions," he said in a voice filled with contempt. The audience settled down restlessly. The room was ready to see an open duel. The peasant, with his hat under his arm and his notebook clutched, walked firmly. The humiliation that everyone had expected at the beginning now seemed like a double-edged sword. The tension could be cut with the very pen of the notary. The judge threw the first question like a stone hidden in velvet. "What do you mean by undivided inheritance in a collateral line?" he asked. The whole room held its breath. It was a technical term designed to break it. Mateo closed his eyes for a moment, reviewing sleepless nights and wasted ink. Then he calmly opened his mouth. "It means that no heir can sell without consent." The students nodded in disbelief. The answer was impeccable. Alejandro swallowed, but didn't stop. "And what happens if one of those heirs signs a contract secretly?" Mateo looked up, his voice firm. "That contract is ineffective without community validation." The room erupted in murmurs. Some peasants raised fists in pride. A student murmured, "It's like teaching is in my blood." The judge muttered frustration like poison. Villagran intervened with his calculated venom. "You cite articles, but do you understand their consequences?" he said mockingly. Mateo stared at him. "I understand that these consequences either take away or give us back our lives." The response drew spontaneous applause that not even the judge's gavel could silence. Students began taking notes not about law, but about dignity. The lawyer looked down for a second. He had received a blow in public. The judge insisted, becoming more and more desperate. "How do you ensure that those old records are still valid today?" Mateo opened his notebook and noted, "Because taxes continue to be paid under those limits." Salinas nodded. "You're right. It's in the treasury." A roar of approval filled the room. Mockery turned to respect. The judge lost the breath of the courtroom, and with it, some of his authority. The peasants, sitting in the back, began to believe the impossible. The man who plowed the land spoke the language of the judges. It wasn't a costume, it wasn't theater, it was study, pain, and love for his community. The humiliation they had prepared for him had become a lesson for everyone. "A peasant does not dictate laws," Villagran had said, and yet every sentence of Matthew seemed to dictate the only true law: justice. Alejandro took a deep breath, trying not to let the crack in his voice show. "This is an interrogation, not a public forum," he growled. But it was too late. The platform had taken over. Mateo closed the notebook and said, "I didn't come to win, I came to defend." His words floated like seeds ready to germinate. And the audience, excited, knew they had just witnessed a turning point in history. When it seemed that Villagran was defeated, he took a sealed letter out of his briefcase. "If the old papers fail, here is the fresh confession," he said maliciously. It was a document signed by Pedro Herrera, Mateo's cousin, giving the land to the hacienda. The audience gasped in disbelief. How could blood betray them like that? Mateo paled. He recognized his cousin's signature, but something in the writing disturbed him. The judge smiled like someone who finds oxygen in the midst of a shipwreck. Villagran gloated over the open wound. "Not even your own family supports you, Mr. Ramirez. What value does your struggle have now?" The audience murmured in a mixture of grief and anger. Some lowered their heads in shame. The peasant clenched his fists, remembering nights of family council under the moon. Pedro never wanted to confront the landowners. He was afraid, he thought bitterly. But the pain didn't steal his voice. It turned it into fire. "I demand an expert opinion," Mateo exclaimed, banging the table hard. "My cousin is a man of his word, but that signature is not his." The judge immediately agreed. "There will be a handwriting and legal review." Villagran feigned confidence. "Don't be afraid, it will pass any test." But the wavering of his gaze gave him away for a second, and the public, hungry for truth, perceived the crack. The judge tried to take advantage of the storm. "Blood treason is stronger proof than songs in the square," he said cruelly. The peasants were outraged, shouting, "Lies! Manipulation!" The benches shook under the weight of the bodies rising. The room became a volcano about to erupt. The sheriff hit the ground, but the ground roared louder than he did. Mateo, his face flushed, raised the notebook. "My family is bigger than a scared cousin. My family is this town." The audience responded with wild applause, tears in their eyes. The students took note. It wasn't a plot. It was living history. "A contract can lie, but an entire community cannot," Mateo added. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from truth. Villagran pressed his lips together until they turned white. He knew that the strategy was slipping through his fingers. Still, he kept the paper like someone keeping a dull knife. "We'll see what science says," he muttered disdainfully. But his face was glistening with sweat. The mask was cracking. The public would not forget that image. The chapter ended with Matthew looking the judge straight in the eyes. "I don't fear blood treason. I fear the treason of justice more." The silence was absolute. No one breathed for an eternal moment. The judge looked down, unable to bear it. The humble peasant had inverted the hierarchy with a phrase, and the echo of those words was recorded in every corner of the courtroom. Outside, the courthouse began to shake with a metallic noise and a red glow. The hacienda foreman, mounted on horseback, had surrounded the building with rifles. The torches lit up the square like an announced hell, casting sinister shadows. Inside, mothers clutched their children, men stared angrily at the broken windows. Judge Alejandro, on the other hand, smiled with satisfaction, as if he had found unexpected reinforcements. "Now you'll see who has the real power," he muttered with venomous cynicism. The crowd reacted with suppressed fury. "It's a threat!" a peasant woman shouted, raising her fist at the armed guards. Judge Salinas banged his head on the table. "If they come in with weapons, it will be a state crime." But his words seemed to bounce off Alejandro's arrogance and Villagran's coldness. Fear mixed with indignation in an explosive cocktail. The room was no longer a courtroom. It was a cauldron about to explode. The peasants began to sing an ancient hymn. Their voices roared like a river that refuses to be stopped by stones. The law students, initially skeptical, timidly joined the chorus. The judge banged his gavel, but it no longer imposed order. Its echo sounded empty. Villagran, with icy calm, leaned toward him. "Let them sing. Soon they will be out of breath." The words were poison that sought to sow despair. Mateo raised his notebook as if it were a banner. "We will not respond with violence because that is what they want," he shouted. The room erupted in thunderous applause, a human wall against intimidation. A peasant boy from the back shouted, "Defend us, Mateo!" The man took a deep breath. He felt the weight of an entire town on his chest, and he understood that he couldn't go back even if they destroyed him. A guard came running in with a distraught face. "Your Honor, they're loading weapons outside." The metallic sound of dozens of rifles being readied pierced the walls like a dark roar. Some women cried, believing that it would be the end. Judge Alexander stood up triumphantly. "Order will prevail, even if it means fire." The people responded with cries of fury. "That is not order, that is tyranny." Villagrán stepped forward with an icy voice. "No one said they'll shoot. They're just protecting what's theirs." The cynicism provoked an outburst of collective indignation. The magistrate stood firmly. "What is yours is fear, and nothing else." The peasants raised improvised banners, written in charcoal, "The earth is life." The clash between fear and hope filled every corner of the courtroom. Mateo stepped forward to the center of the room. His voice boomed loudly. "If we fail today, we'll never get back in here." The people fell silent. Everyone understood the weight of his words. Villagrán smiled, confident that fear would eventually break them. But the crowd responded with a unified cry. "They will not silence us!" The echo rumbled like thunder in the cracked walls. The judge tried to use the violence of fear as his last card. "Resist as much as you want. Outside they have rifles, in here they only have words." Mateo stared at him. "Words are seeds, and yours die in the mud." The judge nodded, knowing that he was facing a historic moment. The court was an erupting volcano ready to redefine justice. The embers of resistance burned with a force that was impossible to extinguish. The crack of a gunshot echoed inside the courtroom like suppressed thunder. The echo struck hearts and froze every breath in the air. A local guard fell to the ground, his arm bleeding, screaming in pain. Chaos broke out. Women screamed, peasants rushed to the doors. Judge Alejandro, far from being horrified, smiled sadistically. "See? The law is written with gunpowder, not with the prayers of peasants." The room roared with fierce indignation. "Infiltrating assassins!" several shouted as they pointed at the attacker. The magistrate ordered that he be disarmed immediately. The guards dragged him to the stand, still holding the smoking barrel. He was an undercover foreman in a guard uniform, a farmhand. "You can arrest me, but there are dozens more outside," he spat hatefully. Mateo stepped forward before he was lynched. "Not with violence," he shouted in a broken but firm voice. "If we respond in kind, we become what we swore to defeat." The audience hesitated, some with tears of rage in their eyes. The peasant song resumed, stronger than the smell of gunpowder. The court trembled with the strength of a people who would not yield. Villagrán tried to regain control. "You see? Fear wins. Gunpowder is not discussed. It is obeyed." Mateo responded, raising his notebook. "Written texts live longer than bullets." A solemn silence fell over the room, as if those words were an oath. The peasants followed him, raising banners and shouting in unison. The judge clenched his fists, increasingly cornered by the truth. Journalist Ernesto Galvez raised his notebook. "I need to get out. I have to send this to the Telegraph before they silence everything." The audience surrounded him, arguing loudly. Some feared for their lives. Others knew it was their only salvation. Mateo looked at him urgently. "Run not for yourself, run for all of us." The journalist nodded, tears in his eyes, before heading for the side door. A group of peasants escorted him outside amid shouts and distant gunfire. The entire room held its breath for endless seconds. Judge Alejandro muttered sarcastically, "It will never reach its destination." Villagrán smiled like a predator smelling fresh blood. The silence weighed like a tombstone on everyone's chest. But then a young peasant came in panting. "He did it!" The room erupted in jubilation like a flooded river. The journalist had reached the Telegraph. The whole country would know the truth. Peasants were crying, students were clapping wildly. The guards hesitated between repressing or joining the people. The judge pounded the gavel furiously, but his voice was a broken echo. Hope shone like a flame that was impossible to extinguish. Mateo took a deep breath, tears in his eyes. Today they tried to silence us with mockery, with forged papers and with bullets. But they couldn't, because the truth doesn't give up. The crowd roared in ground-shaking applause. The judge raised his hand and declared, "Justice will not die today." Villagran lowered his gaze, aware that the battle was changing hands. The sound of trumpets crossed the square like a dawn that didn't ask permission. The torches became small as the hooves hit the cobblestones. The foreman looked at the uniforms and remembered the weight of the law. Inside the courtroom, the crowd felt the air rush back into their chests. Judge Alejandro gripped the gavel like a child clutching a broken toy. Villagran calculated escape routes with his eyes, but none of them led home. The banners were planted in front of the doors with a resounding stillness. "This facility remains under the custody of the state," Salinas repeated without flinching. An officer ordered the entrance cleared and anyone armed searched. The square obeyed the tone that does not shout, but that cuts like a knife. The butts that were hitting wood were now hitting the retreat. Fear, that old pattern, began to lose its payroll. The law students lowered their backpacks and offered bandages. The young doctor coordinated treatments on worn wooden benches. Don Ramon dictated names, times, and events in his firm archival handwriting. Ernesto told the officer the entire story from the first insult. Each voice became a line in a record that no one could deny. The truth finally had enough scribes to avoid dying. Alejandro tried to regain his dignity with a textbook phrase. "Public order has been disturbed by irresponsible agitators." Salinas looked at him like one looks at a broken chair in a formal hall. "Order is disturbed by weapons, not by singing citizens." A murmur of approval flowed through the marble without apology. The judge understood that his echo no longer inhabited those walls. Villagran, in an icy voice, asked to preserve evidence from the defense. The officer replied, "Everything will be preserved, even your private visits." It was an elegant scalpel delving into the fabric of favors. The lawyer straightened his back, but the knot was already tied. Mateo observed without triumphalism, like someone watching rain after drought. He knew the mud could still swallow careless steps. A farmer from Zacatecas took courage and spoke up. "Today we are not asking for revenge, we are asking for the exact measure of justice." His accent crossed LA gazes that understood the message. "What is stolen with a seal is returned with a sentence," he concluded. An officer noted without embellishment how a border is established. "Let it be written down so that no one can disguise it later." Cousin Pedro wasn't there, but his ink shadow was. The document was sent to the appraisal with an escort and receipts. Ernesto took a photograph of the sealed envelope in front of everyone. The image was a lock of light against any blow. Villagran smiled faintly, like someone who still holds a match. Salinas noticed this and asked for double protection without raising his voice. The mothers handed out water in clear plastic cups. The hands trembled less, as if drinking certainty. Someone began a short prayer that sounded like guided breathing. The tired children slept with their heads on warm skirts. The court stopped smelling of gunpowder and started smelling of people again. To that smell that files don't keep but saves. The officer in charge asked for witnesses in a line, without crowds. Today, every story is a brick to support the truth. In the line, palm hats and university jackets were mixed. No one asked about origins. The wound was the one who took the turn. Alejandro heard two versions and didn't believe either of them that would burn him. But he knew that now his disbelief was worth less than a counterfeit stamp. Salinas announced that the process would be urgently upgraded. "This file no longer fits on a gavel table." The applause did not thunder. It breathed deeply and long. It was the serenity that follows lightning when it does not fall in vain. Mateo closed his notebook and kissed it like a tool. not to worship him, but to remind him of his job as bread. The chapter closed with hooves slowly moving away, with shadows dissolved by lanterns and not by torches, with the city listening to a new rumor on its rooftops, with an old judge in a seat who no longer obeyed, with a lawyer memorizing hallways that lead nowhere, and with a people who have proven that fear is not destiny, it is method. The next morning, the newspapers carried the same photograph, a worn notebook held like a banner in the middle of the courtroom. The headline crossed borders. A peasant made pride tremble. In Los Angeles, entire communities read over mate and coffee. In Oaxaca, the kitchens woke up with the smoke of proud tortillas. History, at last, spoke two accents and a single pulse. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation against Alejandro and Tomas without hesitation. Accounts, visits, contracts, signatures, everything under a full-day scrutiny. The humiliating judge could no longer find words to save him. The lawyer who bought silence heard the sound of ice breaking. The corridors quickly learned that they were not theirs or their suits. Impunity, for the first time, arrived late to its appointment. The handwriting report was read in a smaller room. Affected signature, inconsistent features, added pressure, they ruled. The cousin's document turned to moral ash in one paragraph. The sealed envelope completed its journey without any damage or shortcuts. Villagran closed his eyes like someone listening to his own clock. Salinas requested that the opinion be attached to the case as a priority. Don Ramon submitted certified copies of his personal records. They were pages of history that smelled of ink and exact time. My profession wasn't a business, it was a service, he said without boasting. The students stood up to applaud the grammar of decency. Mateo took his hand with the respect of a grandson and neighbor. A brief applause sustained that bridge between professions and destinies. Ernesto published the chronicle with maps, names, and voices. There were no unnecessary adjectives. There were facts that knew how to speak. The photo in the notebook traveled through cables and screens like the wind. In L.A., a Latin radio station read excerpts between job advertisements. "If he could learn the law, I can learn my English," said one listener. Dignity sometimes enters through a dial and never leaves. Alejandro handed over his passport even though no one asked for it. It was a useless gesture from someone trying to appear cooperative. Salinas, without looking at him, commented, "Cooperation is proven by walking." The foremen disappeared from the square like heavy shadows. Their footprints remained in the soil and in public memory, and there also remained a list of names that the sun does not erase. Mateo returned to his community with furrowed steps. He was not welcomed with fires, but with bread on a long table. People touched the notebook with their fingers as if reading Braille, not to idolize him, but to promise him honest use. "We will continue studying together in whatever light there is," he said. The people responded with a word that sounds like a pact. Together. At school, a teacher pasted up clippings and drew boundaries. Today's class is about maps that don't move with bribes. The children drew streams and fences with borrowed colors. They learned that the law can also speak their language, that a stamp doesn't weigh more than your lunch if it's a lie. Justice takes time, but it knows how to walk in sandals. The church lent the hall for legal reading workshops. Migrants arrived back and forth with stories from two coasts. A young LA lawyer explained due process in a simple voice. A peasant translated for his neighbor with the patience of a brother. The notebook on the table seemed to announce the turns, and every turn was a beacon turning on without permission. The afternoon brought clouds and promises, as afternoons tend to do. Mateo planted corn with hands that already knew how to underline articles. The earth received the seed with the gratitude of old friends. There were no speeches. There was sweat and a smile without announcements. Sometimes true endings are written with a shovel and water, and the rest the newspapers learn later. The chapter closed without fanfare, with deep breathing, with houses that dined on bread and a map laughter, and a compass. With a big city looking down on a small town without condescension. With a judge learning that marble also cools. With a lawyer understanding that the night has memory. And with a notebook ready to be opened when needed again. Weeks later, the photograph in the notebook crossed borders without requiring a visa. In Los Angeles, community newspapers printed it on the front page. "A farmer defied power and won respect in the courts," read the headline. Boyle Heights coffee shops read the news between sweetbread and hot coffee. In Oaxaca, the kitchens proudly remembered, "That man is one of us." The echo no longer belonged to a people, it belonged to two worlds united by dignity. Mateo wasn't looking for fame. He returned to the countryside wearing the same worn clothes. His hands returned to the furrow, but his gait had a different weight. The children followed him with blank notebooks, wanting to imitate his path. The community built a small library next to the chapel. On the middle shelf was the old notebook, lovingly protected, not as a relic, but as a living tool of resistance. Alejandro and Villagran faced trials for corruption and forgery. Their faces, once symbols of arrogance, appeared in newspapers as examples of shame. The laughter they once used as weapons became heavy shadows. The public no longer saw them as untouchables, but as defeated men. The power they believed to be eternal slipped through their fingers like water, and history was responsible for remembering it with indelible ink. In Los Angeles, migrants organized community meetings. They read the Chronicle as if it were a sermon of hope. "If a peasant learned law without a lawyer, what can't we do?" a woman asked with tears in her eyes as she held immigration papers. The echo of the struggle did not stay in San Isidro. It became a global seed, and each page of the notebook inspired me to write new stories of resistance. Mateo, humble, never accepted being a hero. "I was just a man who refused to be silent," he repeated. But in every square, in every house, they called him a symbol. The town painted murals with his figure holding the notebook. The children drew a peasant facing judges with words. The myth was born without asking permission, fueled by collective memory. Journalist Ernesto published a book with the whole story. It wasn't fiction. It was a mirror everyone wanted to look into. It sold out in bookstores in Mexico and at book fairs in California. The communities bought it not for letters, but for justice. The notebook became a printed flag, traveling in backpacks. It was the voice of the voiceless, now translated into thousands of accents. Don Ramon, the notary, died months later, but he left his black notebook in the same library. The people placed it next to Mateo's like two guardians. Together they formed the archive of a truth that never fades. At his funeral, peasants sang the resistance anthem, and the students promised to continue defending the law with dignity. Judge Salinas gave a speech that was broadcast on national channels. "Let us not forget that justice does not belong to robes but to the people." His words resonated in law universities and rural squares. The contrast with Alexander was abysmal. One sought pride, the other service. Mateo listened from his village, grateful, with discreet tears, and he knew that the seed had already germinated in broader lands. Borders did not stop history. On the contrary, they multiplied it. In neighborhoods of Los Angeles, the case was taught in bilingual schools. In Oaxaca, young people studied law inspired by Matthew. The echo became education, the most feared weapon by the corrupt. What began as humiliation ended as a silent revolution. An old notebook had rewritten the dignity of generations. The audience never forgot the phrase Mateo shouted in the room. "You can call me a peasant as an insult, but the land supports me." Those words became a motto on marches and banners. Students painted them on university murals. The migrants embroidered them on community flags. It was a declaration that no one would ever again be humiliated in silence. And now, if this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here we continue to tell the stories of ordinary people who have become symbols. Remember, You don't need titles or suits to fight for justice. Only faith, perseverance, and the courage to never give up. Because if a peasant with a notebook could defeat an arrogant judge, you too can write your own victory against injustice.